Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Evening with Poe. We appreciate everyone who's joining us tonight. My name is Maddie Gallen. I'm the Director of Programs and Outreach for the Independence Historical Trust. The Trust is a philanthropic partner to Independence National Historical Park, and we're very excited to be co-hosting this program with them. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules for you. You want to make sure your viewing option is on speaker. That will give you the best viewing for tonight's program. If you have a question during the program, you're welcome to put it in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. We do have set aside time at the end of the program to answer all questions. And lastly, this program will be recorded and we will be putting it on Facebook after the evening. So with that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our host for this evening, as well as one of the Poe experts here at the park, Park Ranger Paul Campbell. I will now turn this over to Paul.
Thank you, Maddie, and good evening, everybody. Good evening to all of our viewers. Hopefully you can all hear me. But welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site here in Philadelphia. The house that you will soon be going through is, in fact, the only surviving Philadelphia residence for Edgar Allan Poe. Now, of course, October is a pretty ideal month to think about this great author of the early 19th century. For one thing, of course, he's pretty well known for tales of terror, and we are obviously getting pretty close to Halloween. But also, so another important reason why it's good to focus on this author now is October is actually the month in which Edgar Allan Poe passes from this earth. Is still still unsolved, in fact, a mystery of his death. He passes away on the date October the 7th of 1849. Kind of ironic that this is still an unsolved mystery. Ironic because, of course, Edgar Allan Poe, this is actually one of his more flattering monikers here, is known as the father of the detective story. In fact, ushering in the detective genre, in fact, is going to happen right here in the city of Philadelphia with the publication of Murders in the Rue Morgue, considered to be the first work of its kind, that is, work of short detective fiction. But of course, this is one of many stories that Poe is still renowned with still to this day. And actually, for that matter, it's a big reason why Philadelphia claims Edgar Allan Poe's literary legacy, because a lot of cities actually kind of get into the argument here of who is most deserving of Edgar Allan Poe. He will spend a total of 6 years in Philadelphia, and our unique claim to him, if you will, is that the majority of his best-known writings were actually composed while living in the city. And these include stories, again, like Murders in the Rue Morgue, but also the classic tale of terror, The Telltale Heart will also be composed while he's still living here, as will be The Fall of the House of Usher, The Gold Bug, Mask of the Red Death, Pit and the Pendulum. And one story in particular here that we always like to focus on at the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site for reasons that will be revealed later on in the tour, and this is The Black Cat. We think it also likely that Edgar Allan Poe probably wrote the majority of The Raven while living here. The Raven was actually published after he had left Philadelphia and had moved to New York, but we know that he actually did spend some time working on this poem, so likely that did encompass some years that he spent, of course, in the city, but also, for that matter, right here in the house that you are about to visit. We like to think of this house as a monument to creativity. As we go through, again, you'll shortly discover here, the rooms are completely unfurnished, so you can kind of furnish them with your own imagination. But also the walls have been stripped down to the original layer of plaster as well. It does give it a little bit of a creepy look, and I suppose that's somewhat appropriate considering the thematic material of so many of Poe's writings here. But as to the house itself, that's actually right on the other side of the camera, so I'm just going to turn this around here. And here we have it. The house itself, although it's probably obvious to you why the statue of the Raven is there, of course, in honor of what I think a lot of people would consider to be Poe's most famous work of poetry. But the house itself, it's actually back in the 1840s, at the time when Poe lived here, it was two separate residences. And after Poe leaves, there are going to be modifications made to the house over time that essentially make it look like one very big structure. But the part specifically where Poe lived is the part that I am, focusing the camera on right now. That is specifically the left side of the property. Poe will live in this house with his wife, Virginia, who unfortunately at this point in her life is suffering pretty badly from tuberculosis. In fact, she's not going to live for too much longer after the family moves from here. Also, his mother-in-law, that is Virginia's mother, but Poe's mother-in-law, Maria Clem, and also the family cat, Katerina, will also live with the family as well. All right, let's enter the house. Now, I'm not going to be doing this tour on my own, but actually some friends are going to be helping me out. And as we go from one floor to the next, you will be able to meet them. They will share their expertise with us. Now, where Poe himself actually lived, sorry if the camera's bouncing around a little bit here. Hopefully nobody's getting seasick in the process. The part where Poe actually lived begins through this door right here. This is the front entrance to the house. And as we cross the threshold here, we are entering the parlor. And it's Ranger Steve.
Hello, everyone. Good evening to you. Welcome to Poes House. A lot of people often ask, why is Poe here in Philadelphia? They know he was in Richmond, in Baltimore. After all, he died in Baltimore. Even New York. So why Philadelphia? He was here for 6 years. Because it was a publishing center, along with New York, along with Boston. Poe's here for the money. He's here for the business of writing. He's not only contributing tales, he's editing. He wants to start his own magazine. He is a notable critic. He is one of the few in this time period solely trying to make a living through writing. And when he's working here in Philadelphia at the time that he was living in his house, he is purely freelancing. So we walk about this building, small building, but it was perfect for his wife, his mother-in-law, his business. And this is the last house that he lived in before going to New York. He started in New York, came to Philadelphia, goes back to New York. And some of that might have been purely none of his fault, but it was a bad depression that began in 1837 that lasted until about 1844, which was the same year that he leaves this house. So if you'd like, we go next door. It's a very interesting house as we go from the parlor, the vestibule, to the front door, to what may have been the kitchen and dining room. And here we are, nearly in the dark, and it looks like a ruin around us with walls that are flaking, and it looks like a horror show, and why people like to come here in October. But when Poe lived here, this was a new house. He may have been one of the first tenants. He's living in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which ended a few blocks in that direction. One of the principal reasons why we think he wanted to rent his house has to do with Virginia's illness, which is consumption. That's what tuberculosis was known in the 19th century. And the house is facing south. It's a cloudy night, but if the sun was in front of this house, it'd be in front of this house throughout the entire time he was here, including the winter time. We don't think there was anything built in front of this house until the 1850s. Largest house that he lived in during his career, 3 floors and a cellar. Oh yes, the cellar, which you'll see. This is the heart of Muddy's existence. Muddy, who's Poe's aunt and mother-in-law, who cooked, cleaned, took care of a sick daughter, pinched the pennies that Poe brought in, took care of him when he was a little bit under the weather with drink. This is a new house, and it was very, very, filled with the latest inventions. Running water into the house, gas light. You can't be better than that. So never think of this house purely as a ruin that's representing Poe in his state of mind. Think of him as a young writer trying to get by, trying to do his best for himself, his wife, his family, and trying to make an existence here in Philadelphia.
All right. Thank you, Ranger Steve.
Thank you.
And now we'll head up to the second floor. And Steve, I trust we will see you at the end of this tour for a little Q&A from our visitors.
All right, take care.
All right. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let us head up to the second floor, or the thin hallway here. But actually not bad for a rental, shared by 3 people. I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to visit Poes House in Baltimore. It's actually a little more cramped than this one. For that matter, if my understanding is correctly, there were even more people living in that one. There's a total of 3 floors to the house, two rooms on each level. And here we have Ranger Ben. Ranger Ben, how are you?
Just fine.
All right.
So this is the room that we speculate is where Poe would have written. We think this might have been his office. And the reason is there's very few modifications made to the inside of this house in the years since Poe lived here. But one of them is that this wall right here has been added since the time that Poe lived here. So originally this room would have been open to the stairway. Therefore, it's not very appropriate for a bedroom. Therefore, it might have been his office. So we've got this scrim here where you can see Poe diligently working on his fiction or poetry. People often wonder, how did Poe write the things that he wrote? And he kind of helpfully wrote an essay called The Philosophy of Composition, where he describes how he created the things that he did. And in this essay, he describes kind of how often people have this idea of writers just going by intuition, that they start writing something and then just by accident, they get ideas in their head and they just keep going from there. And it all kind of just happens almost just in a fit of inspiration. And he says that's totally wrong. If you're going to be a good writer, you should have your conclusion first. Know how the story is going to end. Or if you're writing a poem, know the effect you want the poem to have. And then once you know how it's supposed to end or what effect you're aiming for, build something that leads perfectly to that conclusion that you are trying to grasp. But it's a weird essay, this philosophy of composition, because he supposedly explains how he wrote The Raven in this essay. And it's almost like he's trying to claim that he reverse engineered The Raven. He says, you know, well, the best works of literature are short, so you can get them in one reading session. The best type of literature is poetry because it's so musical. A really great poem should have a really great theme, and the best theme is beauty. And the most beautiful emotion is melancholy. And a great poem also needs to have a refrain that's really catchy. That would be Nevermore. At one point, he even says, I needed to have an animal saying this refrain, and a parrot would have worked, but well, a raven's more appropriate to the theme of melancholy, so I went with that instead. And today, literary critics are pretty divided. Most English literary critics think that this philosophy of composition essay is one of Poe's many hoaxes, that he's kind of just tricking the audience and having fun at our expense. But French literary critics actually think that the essay really describes his way of writing poetry and short stories. So it's hard to know what to make of this. If Poe is just pulling a prank, or if he's actually telling us his technique, or maybe if there's a little bit of both mixed in. I can't resolve that mystery for you. So we're going to go to the next room on this floor, right now, this way.
It's tough to imagine that poem having the same gravitas if it read, quote, the parrot Nevermore.
So our speculation is that this was actually Poe's bedroom. We don't know for a fact who slept in which parts of the house, but the reasons we think that this is where Poe might have slept are a couple. First off, with his wife Virginia being terribly ill with tuberculosis, they probably did not share a bedroom. It would have been very difficult to sleep in a bed with someone who had been violently coughing all night long. And then the reason this would be an appropriate room for Poe is back at the time that Poe lived here, there wasn't an addition to this side of the house. So there would have actually been a real window right here. And then there's also windows right here as well. So you've got a nice corner bedroom with a great view of the world. And of course, what writers do is they observe the world around them. They describe the things that they see and they observe human behavior. So this seems like a good place for Poe to have lived. And when it comes to Poe's kind of observation of the world around him, there's really only one thing that he wrote, right? I think he's genuinely describing an experience he had, and he's not filtering it through the eyes of a fictional character. He's saying, I, Edgar Allan Poe, saw that. And that would be a small essay he wrote called Morning on the Wissahickon. And it's about Poe's time here in the Philadelphia area. I'm sure some of you watching this have been to the Wissahickon River Valley and some of you haven't. So let me just kind of describe in brief what that is. It's now part of the city of Philadelphia. It's part of Fairmount Park. And when you go there today, it's hard to believe you're in the city. You get down in this river valley and you're almost like in a gorge. The walls are very steep around you. It's very heavily forested. You can't hear the sounds of the city at all. It feels like you're in a wild place. And that's how it was in Poe's time too. He writes in this essay about how he has this urge to find places that are untamed. And I think this is an expression of Poe's always longing for something transcendent. The essay concludes with him describing being in the river valley and looking up on a ridge, and he sees this elk come to the top of the bridge. And it's a stunning sight to think that there would still be wild elk in Pennsylvania as late as the 1840s. And as Poe is in awe at this spectacle, suddenly it all changes. He sees a servant come out from the forest holding a halter and a lump of salt. And he coaxes the elk with the lump of salt and puts the halter on the elk's neck. And Poe later on finds out that the elk was just a pet. It wasn't, there aren't wild elk in Pennsylvania anymore, even back then. And I think that's also very telling of Poe. He's actually kind of privately admitting that he, the guy who likes pulling hoaxes on people all the time, he got a little hoaxed himself. And moreover, this is both his kind of longing for transcendence, but also his cynicism. The thing that he thought was transcendent actually is just a trick of the imagination.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ben. I trust we will see you as well for Q&A at the end. So we will say goodbye to Ben for the moment. We shall meet again. And one last floor, 2 more rooms to see, or at least 2 more rooms above ground. So as Ben was mentioning, we're not entirely sure who slept in which room. So there is a certain amount of conjecture here, but this we have labeled as Virginia's room. Edgar Allan Poe's poor suffering wife, who will pass away just a couple years following their departure from Philadelphia, dies at the young age of 24. And as Ben mentioned, of consumption or tuberculosis. And horrible coincidence here, when Poe was only 2 years old, he had lost his mother, in fact, at the age of 24. And also from that same illness, tuberculosis. Here we have a picture of Virginia, looking rather sickly. This is an artist rendering that was actually done sometime after her passing. As horrible as these events are in Poe's life, the tragedy that he faces, you can certainly speculate on how this has influenced some of his best-known writings. Certainly The Raven would be one. Ligeia, which is a short story Poe considered to be his own personal best work, a short story about a man who loses the love of his life, his first wife, and although he does remarry, he can never really quite rekindle those same feelings of romance for his second wife as he had for his first. The end of the story, his wife does in fact, his first wife, that is, the Lady Ligeia, does come back to him. However, it is believed that it was very likely an opium-induced hallucination that the character in the story was in fact having. Another important work that we think is going to be inspired by the tragic occurrences that Poe faces with losing some of the women that he's closest to in his life is the poem Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago, in this kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. And it is believed, very likely, to have been a poem about his wife. There is some speculation, admittedly, that there are some other women that it may have been about. But I guess I personally like to believe it's about his wife. All right, the next and final room, above ground that is Maria Clem's room, the mother-in-law. And we speculate this would be a good room for her because, right, she'd be, of course, very close to her poor suffering daughter, so she could, would be able to offer constant care for. This room, it's the tiniest one as far as the bedrooms go. And it actually reminds me a little bit of Poe's Tale of Terror, The Telltale Heart, which does take place in a tiny, cramped apartment. And it's interesting, when Poe moves to Philadelphia, a lot of his stories are actually taking on something of an urban flair, I suppose. The Telltale Heart, this is a story that I imagine a lot of our viewers are familiar with, about a man who commits murder. He murders an elderly gentleman for the reason that he doesn't like his eye. As he describes it, it's a pale blue eye, like a vulture's, and doesn't match the color of his other eye, so he determines the best way to cure himself of his madness is to do away with the elderly gentleman. But he's living in a city. He's not living out in a country estate, so his options are limited in terms of trying to cover up his crime, what to do with the body. So he comes up with what he thinks is a very clever idea, and that is to carve the body up into pieces and put it underneath the floorboards of his house. But it appears that his conscience will not let him get away with this foul deed. He believes he can hear his murdered victim's heart beating underneath the floorboards, which is very likely his conscience actually speaking back to him. By the way, there is a rather curious feature of this room. Yeah, it's right over here. I've always been curious about this because it actually appears that this floorboard can be removed. I've never actually, done this before. So I don't know, maybe I'll, just for the first time, I'll do it now. Let's see, what could, oh, it does come up. How about that? Oh my goodness. Wonder how long that's been there. Oh, good Lord. I think I've overspent my welcome here. I think it's time for me to leave. Maybe I'll head down to the cellar. Yeah, that'll be a safe place. Cellar. Okay. Go. Ranger Ben, Ranger Steve. See them. They seem to have disappeared. Lord, I hope this isn't turning into the Blair Witch Project. All right. Cellar. Cellar is this way. Oh, Ranger Luke. Thank goodness there's somebody else here. You'll never guess what I found up on the third floor.
What's that?
A severed hand.
Oh no.
Oh
man. Well, what did they think of that?
So I don't know. I haven't gotten any responses yet. I don't know. I guess we'll find out at the end if anybody comments.
It's a little dark in here,
Yeah.
so I brought some aid so I could talk to you folks.
Oh,
How's everybody doing? Welcome to the cellar of the Edgar Allan Poe House. Arguably the most exciting part of this whole house, and probably the most visited part of the building. My name's Luke, and it's always a pleasure to be able to introduce this kind of spooky place to you, right? Especially during this time of year. Now, when we're here in the cellar of Edgar Allan Poe's house, really what we focus on is a story that was written right here in this house by Edgar Allan Poe, 1843, called The Black Cat. Maybe some of you have read it. If you haven't, it's a great story, but there's going to be some spoilers here, to be honest with you. Now, the Black Cat is one of Poe's kind of quintessential horror stories. Right? It's a scary story. And it starts off kind of typical of Poe. He starts off saying, listen, I know you're not going to believe this story. I barely believe it. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I have to write it down, right? Because I'm being hanged tomorrow until death. And Poe, the narrator, who seems kind of Poe-like at times, but the narrator tells us that he was always a big friend of animals. Since the time that he was a young boy, he grew up and he had all kinds of animals. He got married, fell in love, and his house was just full of animals. But his most favorite one was a black cat named Pluto, entirely black, massive cat. That was his best of friend. But the narrator tells us that he falls into a disease, and he tells us what a disease is: alcohol. It starts to change his temperament slowly but surely. He begins to lash out, first at the smaller animals, the dog, even at his wife. But Pluto, his beloved black cat, well, that hangs on till the very end, except one night when he comes home, as he tells us, in a gin-nurtured state from one of his haunts about town. He goes to grab the cat, which has become afraid of him because of his growing violence, and the cat bites him on the hand as he tries to grab it. The narrator flies into a rage, picks up the cat, pulls out a penknife, and plucks its eye out.
Ooh,
Grisly stuff.
I'll say.
The narrator can't live with himself. He feels this guilt growing, this coldness inside of him. He knows what he has to do. A couple of days later, he wakes up in cold blood, wraps a noose around now this one-eyed cat's neck, hangs it on a tree until death. The narrator tells us in the story he does it because he knows this cat loved him. He does it because he knows what he's doing is wrong. He knows that doing this will damn his soul to the fires of hell beyond the forgiveness of any God. This is some dark stuff. This is some guilt building in our narrator, some heavy, heavy guilt that he buries with even more alcohol. He softens a bit, though, towards these animals. He says that he's in one of his debauches about town, one of his hangout, in a half stupefied state, in a place of more than infamy, what the story tells us. And what does he see? Between the hogsheads of gin and rum, he sees a black cat. His heart is softened. The cat takes a liking to him. Nobody in the bar knows where this cat came from. This cat looks just like Pluto. It follows him home. He brings it into his house. The one difference between this cat and Pluto is a white spot right on the center of his chest. He also notices, much to his horror afterwards, that this cat only has one eye. Now, this cat starts to become the bane of our narrator's existence. It follows him all around the house, and for reasons that he can't totally understand, he feels this horror, this disgust whenever this cat comes close to him. And he swears that the white spot on this cat's chest is day by day almost imperceptibly changing into the gallows. Now, he wakes up in the middle of the night. This cat is sitting on his chest, breathing hot air in his face. It feels like a ton on top of him. He can't bring himself to do any harm to this cat until one day he walks into a cellar, much like the one that we're in right now. Poe, maybe, strolling through this very cellar that we're in, trying to find inspiration for this story, trying to get another story published, put food on the table for his family. It says that the narrator of our story walks down some old rickety steps to this basement. The cat, which has plagued him for weeks now, runs in between his feet, almost making him trick. He reacts without thinking, grabs an axe to slay this beast, which has, been terrorizing him, and his wife stays his hand, always the peacemaker. He turns his rage, directs it towards his wife, and without thinking, buries the axe in her head, and she falls without a sound. This beast has driven him to murder. What does our narrator think about? Sorrow for his deceased wife at his own hand? Self-preservation. He looks for a place to bury her. Should I put her in the floor? Now, this basement would have had dirt floors back in the 1800s, but no, he finds an even better place. Something that looks like this. I know it's dark in here, but I hope you can see this. A false chimney, a common architectural feature in 19th century homes built for support. In our story, our narrator takes out the bricks that would have been across here, stuffs the body of his slain wife in a false chimney described in the story, much like the one that you can see right here. And he takes some plaster, some mortar, and buries her within the tomb, as our narrator says, like the medieval monks of old would do in their catacombs. Ever since our narrator slayed this cat, he is experiencing, ever since our narrator slayed his wife, he has been experiencing absolute bliss, right? The cat is nowhere to be found. He hasn't felt this good, hasn't slept this well in weeks. Eventually the police come. His wife has disappeared. They need to investigate. He, in his very laid back state, almost brazenly invites them in, says, look around, come down to the basement. He even talks about how this is such a nicely constructed home. When the police, the inspectors, have had their fill, their curiosity, fulfilled, they go to leave. Our narrator, in his arrogance, taps upon the freshly mortared wall that he had buried his wife behind. And that's when he hears it. A wail, a shriek, our narrator tells us, half of terror, but half of triumph, something from the jaws of hell. Our narrator can't believe it. He falls back, swooning, passing out. But what does he see before he passes out? As the inspectors, dozens of hands, he tells us, are ripping at the brick, he sees on the head of his deceased wife glowing eyes. The black cat. Oh my gosh. I have walled the beast within the tomb is the final lines as our narrator and our story end. It's powerful to stand inside of this space knowing that one of our nation's, one of the world's most prolific authors walk through this very basement trying to find something to write about, a plot device. And in maybe his frustration, his desperation, he sees this hole, this false chimney, and it gives him a little spark in his creativity, one that creates a story that is enjoyed today by people all over the world, the Black Cat. So thanks for joining me in the basement with a little scary story.
And that's a very, very scary cat.
Yes, it is.
Almost as scary as that severed hand. Well, thank you, Ranger Luke.
Yeah.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very appropriate note to conclude our tour on. And at this point, what we're going to do is head back up to an exhibit area. And we're going to take questions. Anybody had questions for me or any of the other rangers who presented talks for you? That is Ranger Steve, Ranger Ben, Ranger, and Ranger Luke. And here we are.
Hey, welcome back. How'd your kids do down there?
Well, we survived. We survived.
That's the most you can hope for.
Yeah.
Survived the third floor, though, from what I could hear from down here.
Yeah. Well, we made it. We made it.
Well, good. Come back into the light. Actually, folks, what we're in right now is Poe's neighbor's house. Built maybe a couple of years before the actual Poe House, so we're actually comprised of two different houses. So we use this as a visitor services area.
Very good. And there is Mr. Poe himself. The light's kind of making it a little bit difficult to see, but this is, I guess, probably not the image of Poe that most people are familiar with. Rather, it would be this one right here, Poe with the mustache, with and without. But actually, for a good part of his adult life, he in fact had no mustache.
Once you show them, we have those in the first edition of Telltale Heart, so that's how it would have looked if you got the subscription.
Mhm. It's one of the few historic artifacts that we actually have here. Now, if you go back prior to this site being run by the National Park Service, for many years, it was run by a man by the name of Richard Gimbel, that is associated with the Gimbel department store chain, in fact. And Gimbel himself, apart from running this house, also had a rather extensive collection of Poe artifacts. Whatever happened to them, you might be wondering? Well, they are still in the city of Philadelphia, or at least I suppose most of them are anyway, at the Philadelphia Free Library. But anyway, I'm just gonna set this down right here. And Maddie, if at any point you want to break in, we'll be more than happy to take questions.
All right, well, thank you so much. As Paul goes over there with his other park rangers, we just remind you, if you have a question for any of them, feel free to put in the Q&A. And I am actually going to turn it over to my co-host, Natasha, who also works with me at the Trust, and she will be asking the questions you guys have written in. Natasha, if you want to start asking some questions, that would be great.
Sure. So one question we have is, Poe worked as a critic. Are there any of those writings that still exist?
Sure.
Tons of them, yeah.
Yeah, in different collections. If you want to read about what he has to say about a lot of fellow writers, it's out there, and some of it's not pretty.
He was merciless, literally, just savage.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just feels like it's kind of unfair that he would be so cruel.
It's
Yeah,
just
here's a classic
cartoon.
cartoon depiction of Poe as a literary critic. He's a hatchet man, as you can see.
The
Right
Tomahawk Man. Oh, closer, yeah. Bring it.
How's that? Tomahawk Man, because he chopped people's works to pieces.
With
Yeah.
tomahawk upraised for deadly blow, behold our literary Mohawk Poe, is how it began.
Yes, indeed. Very cruel in particular to us, cruel in particular to a number of people, you know, accusing Longfellow of plagiarism, for instance, and James Fenimore Cooper of sloppy grammar, I guess some other things.
To be fair though, too, I do have to say, none of Poe's contemporaries have had the lasting literary
That's
fame
right.
that he's had. He was savage to a lot of people that we don't really read that much anymore.
And it helped him gain notoriety and helped him what he thought was a mission to improve American literature.
Still living in the shadow of the British literary
Yeah.
field during this time.
Definitely.
But he did tend to be very kind to female poets. In
Yeah.
fact, the first publication of the Raven and other poems he actually dedicates to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, whose work he admired quite a bit.
All right. So another question, is the Philadelphia Poe House where the mysterious bottle is left annually?
No, that was actually in Baltimore.
Yeah,
And it was by his grave.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I'm not the foremost expert in this, but from what little I know about it, I guess that this went on for about 50 years straight. And then it
Finished
just
out
stopped.
in 09, I think.
Yeah.
Or, yeah,
Yeah, so they believe the person doing it,
200th anniversary.
pure speculation, of course, but they believe the person who was doing it passed away.
And it would have been done on the anniversary of Poe's birth.
On
Or,
his birth.
yes, Poe's birth. It was in January.
And what kind of alcohol was
Cognac?
Cognac, which he
Yeah.
never drank, but
it? Cognac.
I've always been curious to know whatever happened to all those bombs.
that's true too. We don't have to worry about that.
All right. Another question. What are some of the theories surrounding Poe's death?
There's a lot of.
Do we have time?
I mean, so it's a very mysterious death. He was in transit from one place to another and was not supposed to make a stop off in Baltimore, but for reasons we don't know, he did.
Alcohol involved?
Yeah,
that's quite
I
possible.
still think it's alcohol involved.
He basically was found in the street wearing clothing that wasn't his.
Yeah.
And in a state where he was not very articulate. And he was given some medical attention and died the next day. Part of the problem with calling it alcohol poisoning though is that should have killed him faster.
Yeah.
So that it's a little strange
Could
that
have
he held
been
on so long.
exposed, seemed to have gone through delirium tremens where he's seeing things on the wall. He's spouting gibberish, a name Reynolds. all wonderful. It's as if he scripted it himself. So Poe, he was Poe in the Poe story, but he had taken the pledge, meaning he had stopped drinking. About 3 weeks before, I said he cleaned up his act down in Richmond. He's coming back north to settle things and then go back and live in Richmond. So maybe he fell off the wagon. It's very easy to.
If I may say my favorite theory, and I think there is credence to this, there was a type of election scam back then called pooping, where basically people who were political party operatives, it's going to sound nuts, but this is true, this is documented, they would abduct just people, often homeless people or foreigners, and force them to drink large amounts of alcohol or even drug them with opium, and then would force them to change their clothing and vote multiple times, changing their clothing every single time at multiple different polling places to drum up lots of fake votes for their political party.
Yeah, you see that in the film Gangs of New York.
And it was actually a pretty terrible thing if it happens. People died of alcohol poisoning or getting drugged, or sometimes just if they tried to resist it, it would eat them too. So
it was during the election
possible that Poe was actually grabbed in this fashion. That would explain why his clothing was different when it was found. But ultimately, there's no knowledge.
Now it has become a bit of a cottage industry, I suppose, coming up with theories of Poe's passing and rabies. Rabies actually came out, I think, in the early 1990s, so relatively recently. So
kind of stops.
But if any of our viewers want to kind of have some fun with this, do research and come up with your own theory.
There's no death certificate that was needed back then. That's going to be after the Civil War, so that also adds a lot of. I'll give you one, what the doctor said, and then you can find this out. Congestion of the brain. If you look that up in a 19th century way, it's kind of a catch-all for a lot of different things, but that's what it seems to be. At least it was reported in the newspaper, congestion of the brain, which we all have at some point.
Doesn't kill you.
Yeah, it wouldn't kill us, yeah.
All right. Did Poe do most of his work and most of his writing at home?
Ooh, we suspect he did, but you never know. But as a writer, when you're inspired, you can be walking down the street, writing on the back of an envelope. But we think he did. He may have done that on the second floor, but in
the philosophy of composition, which is the only thing where he really describes writing, his writing process in depth. He doesn't describe anything about like physically writing. He doesn't say like, it helps to drink coffee while you're writing. There's no sense of like, what his setup was.
Certainly he can't write when he's drinking alcohol. So that is certain. So he's going to be at his top.
He wasn't Hemingway. He was not drinking and writing.
No, he couldn't. No.
Yeah, he actually does say that it stifles his creativity. So
that
is our public service message. You want to be creative, it's not a good idea to go down that path.
All right, we have one more question right now. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. So the last question that we have for now is, when will the Edgar Allan Poe House be open again for in-person visits?
That would be like his death. We're not. Yeah, it's above our pay grade. When we don't have
a better idea of how he died.
Yeah, we might. Yeah.
It's definitely going to be when case counts are low in terms of COVID-19. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, we don't know.
And just for our audience, you can find information and updates about the park's hours and the buildings that are open on nps.gov/INDE, that's INDE, or the NPS app. If there are no more questions, I think that's it for all of the questions that we have. This recording will be posted on INHT's Facebook page and YouTube channel, and we will be emailing it out to everyone in case you missed the first part or want to watch this again on Halloween for some spooky tours. Thank you guys so much. That's all the questions that we have right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in.
All right.
All right. Thank
For
you
Halloween.
to our wonderful park rangers. I think everyone who is listening is joining me in applause right now, even if you cannot hear us. And I just want to reiterate, if you are looking for programs to attend, please check out the Trust website, check out the park's website. We always post upcoming programs. And if you haven't heard, the park does some amazing programs, especially virtually. So I just want to wish everyone a good night. Thank you again to our host, Paul, and all of our park rangers. And thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Ciao.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.